The envelope was sitting on my kitchen table when I got home from the grocery store. I almost didn't notice it. I'd set my bags down, taken off my coat, started putting the milk away, and then I saw it. My daughter-in-law's name in the return address corner. A law firm's logo printed beneath it. My hands went still. I set the milk down on the counter, not in the refrigerator. I picked up the envelope. My name was typed on the front. Not handwritten. Typed the way you type something when you want distance from what you're doing. When you don't want it to feel personal, even though it is the most personal thing in the world. I opened it at the kitchen table, still in my coat. It took me 3 readings to understand what I was holding. My son and his wife were formally requesting that I have no unsupervised contact with my grandchildren, effective immediately. If I did not comply, they would pursue legal remedies. There was language about boundaries. There was language about emotional harm. There was a list, 3 pages long, of incidents. Things I had apparently done that constituted what their attorney called a pattern of intrusive behavior. I sat there for a long time. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking. A car passed. The refrigerator hummed. The world kept going, indifferent and steady, the way it does when your life is being rearranged without your permission. My name is Lauren. I'm 67 years old. I taught 2nd grade for 31 years in Dayton, Ohio, and I know how to be patient, because 2nd graders will teach you that, or they will break you, and I chose patience. I retired 4 years ago. My husband, Gerald, passed 6 years ago a Tuesday morning in March, quietly, which was so like him. We had 1 son. His name is Daniel, and I raised him in the house where I still live, the house Gerald and I bought when Daniel was 2 years old. I should tell you who I was before I tell you what happened, because I think it matters. I was not a difficult woman. I am not saying that to defend myself. Gerald used to say I was the least complicated person he'd ever loved, and he meant it as a compliment, and I took it as one. I made casseroles. I kept a garden. I volunteered at the public library on Thursday afternoons. When Daniel was growing up, I was the mother who showed up to every school play, every soccer game, every science fair where his project was slightly lopsided but made with genuine effort. I was there. That was my whole philosophy of motherhood. Just be there. Daniel met his wife, Melissa, when he was 28. She was from Connecticut, which I mention not as a criticism but as a fact, because it explains some things about how she understood family. In Connecticut, apparently, family means something more structured, more scheduled, more formal than anything I'd ever known. Gerald's people were from Kentucky. My people were from rural Indiana. We showed up at each other's houses without calling. We dropped off food when someone was struggling. We stayed too long and talked too loud, and nobody thought anything of it. I tried to adapt. I want to be honest about that, because some of the things on that 3-page list were not entirely wrong. I did stop by, unannounced, often. After Gerald died, the silence in my house had a weight to it that I still haven't fully learned to carry. When Daniel and Melissa moved to the house 20 minutes away, I found reasons to drive over. I told myself I was being helpful. Sometimes I was. Sometimes I was just lonely. And I didn't want to say that out loud, because there's a particular shame in being a 60-something widow who misses her son. I did rearrange things once. Once. Melissa had a system in her pantry that made no sense to me, and I reorganized it while she was at her hair appointment and I was watching the girls. I know now that this was wrong. Not malicious, but wrong. It was her pantry. Her system, even if I couldn't understand it. I bought things for my granddaughters without asking. Their names are Sophie and Claire, 8 and 5. Sophie has her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness. Claire laughs so easily, it makes your chest ache. I bought them dresses and books and once a small plastic kitchen set that Melissa said they didn't have room for, and I could see from her face that she'd have rather I hadn't, but I brought it anyway because Claire had pointed at it in the store 3 weeks before and said, "Grandma, look," in that particular voice that 5-year-olds use when they've seen something magical. I don't know how to stop loving someone just because they've told me it's inconvenient. But the letter changed things. Because there's a distance between someone being frustrated with you and someone formalizing that frustration through an attorney. One is a relationship having growing pains. The other is something different, something I didn't have words for yet. I called my son that night. He let it go to voicemail. I called again the next morning. He picked up on the fourth ring, and I could hear in those 4 rings everything I needed to know about where we were. He sounded tired, not angry. Tired in the way people sound when they've been dreading something for a long time and it's finally happening. "I think the letter explains everything," he said. "Daniel," I said, "I'm your mother." "I know, Mom. I need you to talk to me." There was a pause, a long one. In that pause, I heard the 28 years between us, the way I'd held him when he had night terrors at age 4, the way I'd taught him to drive in an empty church parking lot on a Sunday afternoon, the way I'd sat with him in the hospital when Melissa was in labor with Sophie, both of us too nervous to talk, just sitting. "Melissa feels like the girls are getting confused," he said finally, "like they don't know whose rules to follow. Yours or ours. I follow your rules when I'm with them." "Mom, I do. You told Sophie she could have ice cream before dinner last Saturday." I had. I'd told her she could have 1 small scoop if she promised to eat her dinner anyway, and she had, and she'd been proud of herself for keeping the promise, and I'd thought that was the whole lesson. Apparently, it was not. "That's on the list," he said. "There's a list. I've seen the list." Another silence. "We just need some space," he said. "Some structured space. We're not saying never. We're saying, you're saying I need a lawyer to see my granddaughters." He didn't answer. "Daniel." I reorganized a pantry. I brought a casserole. I showed up at Claire's dance recital without telling you I was coming because I wanted to surprise her. My voice was steady. I'd been a second-grade teacher for 31 years. I knew how to keep my voice steady when everything inside me was not. Which of those things caused emotional harm? "It's a pattern, Mom. It's not any one thing. A pattern of loving them. A pattern of not listening to us. That landed differently than the others. Because it wasn't wrong. And I think he knew I knew it wasn't wrong. Because he went quiet again. And the quiet between us was not empty. It was full of things neither of us wanted to say. "I need some time to think," I said. "Okay," he said. Relieved, I thought. I hung up and sat at Gerald's old chair. I still call it Gerald's chair even though he's been gone 6 years, because some things belong to people even after the people are gone, and I asked him what to do. I know he couldn't answer. I know that's not how death works, but I asked anyway, because 34 years of marriage builds a habit of consultation that widowhood doesn't fully break. What I decided, in that chair, was this. I was not going to fight. Not because I thought they were right, not because the list didn't hurt to read, but because I understood something that I think Melissa had never considered, and that Daniel had perhaps forgotten. The girls would grow up. Sophie was 8, and already asking questions that told me she was paying attention to more than the adults around her realized. Claire was 5 and would be 6 and then 10 and then 17, and somewhere in that long becoming, she would understand what had happened in this family. And when that day came, I wanted her to find that her grandmother had handled it with dignity. I called my friend Ruth, who is 71 and sharper than anyone I've ever met, and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is the rarest and most loving thing a person can do. "What are you going to do?" she asked when I finished. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I'm not going to beg." "Good," she said, "and I'm not going to disappear." "Also good. I might need a lawyer." "That," she said, "is excellent." I found a family attorney named Patricia Okafor who had an office downtown and a reputation for being very calm in situations where calmness was hard to come by. She read the letter, read the 3-page list, and looked at me over her reading glasses. "They can request supervised visitation," she said. "They cannot legally enforce it in the state of Ohio without a court order, which they would need to pursue formally. They mentioned legal remedies. They did." She set the letter down. "Mrs. Lauren, Have you done anything that constitutes abuse, neglect, or genuine endangerment of your grandchildren? I told one of them she could have ice cream before dinner. Patricia Okafor looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Let me be honest with you. If they pursue this, and I mean actually file, not just threaten, they will not win. What they're describing is a grandmother who loves her grandchildren too much, and a daughter-in-law who finds that overwhelming. Those are relationship problems, not legal ones. But they could make things worse." "Yes," she said. "They could. Before we talk about legal strategy, I want to ask you something. What do you actually want? Not what you want to win. What do you want?" I thought about it. I thought about Sophie's eyes and Claire's laugh, and the way Claire had said, "Grandma, look in front of a plastic kitchen set in a store." "I want to still be their grandmother," I said. "In 10 years. When none of this feels as important as it does right now." Patricia nodded slowly. "Then let me suggest something that might feel counterintuitive." She suggested I write letters, not to Daniel and Melissa, not yet, to Sophie and Claire. Not about any of this, just letters, the kind grandmothers write. About small things, about the garden, about what I was reading, about a funny thing that had happened at the library. Letters a child could keep, that would exist outside of whatever the adults were doing to each other. I went home and I started writing. "Dear Sophie," I wrote. "Today I found a Luna moth on the porch railing. It was the most extraordinary green, the color of something that shouldn't exist in Ohio in October, and it just sat there for almost an hour, as if it had somewhere to be but wasn't in a hurry. Dear Claire, I made your favorite apple cake today, the one with the cinnamon on top, even though there's no one here to eat it but me. I ate 2 pieces anyway, standing up at the kitchen counter, which is something your grandfather always did and I always told him not to. I understand him better now. I mailed them to the house. Melissa sent them back, unopened, in a plain envelope with no note. I kept writing anyway. I kept the copies. I don't know why exactly, except that it felt important to keep evidence of the loving. Evidence that I had not gone quietly into the nothing they were making for me. It was Ruth who told me, 3 weeks later, that Daniel and Melissa had actually filed. I hadn't expected that. I'd thought the letter was a warning, a formalization of tension, not a genuine beginning of legal action. But they had filed, and I had to appear, and Patricia Okafor prepared me with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this before and found it sad every single time. The courthouse was unremarkable. Beige walls. Fluorescent lights. The particular smell of public buildings that have absorbed decades of difficult days. I wore the gray dress I'd worn to Gerald's retirement party, because it was the most dignified thing I owned, and I wanted to feel dignified. Daniel was already seated when I arrived. He didn't look at me. Melissa sat beside him in a dark blazer, her expression composed in the way that takes effort. Their attorney was a young man who shuffled papers with great purpose. The judge was a woman named the Honorable Catherine Marsh, who appeared to be in her late 50s, with reading glasses on a chain and an expression that suggested she had heard every version of every story and had stopped being surprised sometime around 2009. Their attorney presented the case. He used words like boundary violations and emotional dysregulation, and parental authority undermined. He had a PowerPoint, which I had not expected, with a timeline of incidents. The pantry reorganization, the ice cream, the dance recital attendance, the gifts brought without permission, the visits without advance notice. I sat very still and listened to the story of myself as told by someone who had never met me, assembled from a list made by people who had stopped wanting to see me clearly. Judge Marsh listened without expression. Patricia presented our response. She was brief. She noted my background as a 31-year educator. She noted the absence of any CPS involvement, any incident of harm, any medical or psychological documentation of distress in either child. She noted that the incidents described were, in her phrasing, consistent with a grandmother who loves her grandchildren and is navigating a significant family transition following the death of a spouse. Then she did something I had not expected. She asked to speak to me directly. "Mrs. Lauren," Judge Marsh said. "I've read the filing and I've heard the arguments. I'd like to hear from you. Not legally, your attorney has addressed the legal questions adequately. I want to know what you want to tell me that isn't in the paperwork." I stood up. I had thought about this. I had thought about what I might want to say, if given the chance. I had considered various versions of this moment. The version where I was eloquent, the version where I fell apart, the version where I said something sharp and regretted it. What I said was this: I owe my daughter-in-law an apology. I reorganized her pantry. It was her pantry, and it was wrong of me to touch it without asking. I showed up without calling enough times that I can understand why it felt like a pattern. I didn't listen when I should have. I'm not standing here to tell you I was perfect. I paused. But I also didn't cause harm. I brought casseroles and birthday cards and apple cake with cinnamon on top, and I sat at school plays and dance recitals because I wanted my granddaughters to look into the audience and see someone whose whole face lit up just from seeing them. That's what I was doing. That's all I was doing. The courtroom was quiet. My husband died 6 years ago, I continued. My son is 20 minutes away. My granddaughters are 8 and 5. I know I'm getting older, and the years I have left with them in this particular way, when they still want a grandmother at their school play, when they still say, "Grandma," look, those years are not as many as I'd like them to be. I wasn't trying to take anything from my son and his wife. I was just afraid of running out of time. I sat down. Judge Marsh was quiet for a moment. She looked at Daniel and Melissa. She looked at their attorney. She looked at her notes. Then she said, "I am not going to issue a supervised visitation order." She said it plainly. No drama, no extended speech. She said the situation described did not meet any legal threshold for restricting a grandparent's contact, and that the court was not in the business of adjudicating family communication styles. She said that what she observed in this courtroom was a family in pain, and that what this family needed was not a legal order but a conversation, possibly facilitated by a professional, and she strongly encouraged both parties to pursue that before returning to her courtroom. And then she looked at my son. Not at his attorney, not at Melissa, at Daniel. "You were raised by this woman," she said. "It was not a question. Whatever difficulties exist in your current family dynamic, she raised you. I would encourage you to remember that courts are permanent records. Your daughters will be adults someday. They may want to know what happened here." Daniel's jaw tightened. He said nothing. She closed her folder. That was it. We filed out into the beige hallway. Patricia touched my arm briefly, which I understood to mean well done. Daniel and Melissa left quickly, through a different door, and I stood for a moment in that fluorescent light and breathed. Ruth was waiting in the parking lot. "Well," she said. She didn't grant the order. Ruth exhaled slowly. "Good. It doesn't fix anything," I said. "No," she agreed, "but it's a start." It was not, in fact, a fast start. The weeks after the hearing were quiet in a way that had nothing peaceful about it. Daniel didn't call. Melissa didn't call. I sent Sophie a letter about a hummingbird I'd seen in the garden. I sent Claire a letter about the apple cake. I didn't know if they were receiving them. I kept writing. It was on a Saturday, 6 weeks after the hearing, that my phone rang at 8 in the morning. It was Daniel. "Hi, Mom," he said. He sounded like himself, a version of himself I hadn't heard in a long time. Tired, but present. "Hi," I said carefully. "I've been thinking about what the judge said." I waited. "I've been thinking about it a lot." Another pause. "I don't want Sophie and Claire to read a court file someday and think I don't want them to think I didn't love you, because I do. I just—" He stopped. Started. Again. "Melissa and I are going to see someone, a therapist. For us, and maybe, if you're open to it, eventually for all of us together." I sat down in Gerald's chair. "I'm open to it," I said. "And Mom, I'm sorry. For the letter. The way we did that. You deserved a conversation first." I had imagined this moment many times since the kitchen table, since the letter, since the fluorescent lights of the hallway. I had imagined various things I might say. Things about the pantry being one incident, not a pattern. Things about being made to feel like a problem rather than a person. Things about running out of time. What I actually said was, "Thank you for calling," because the rest of it could wait. The rest of it was for the therapy room, for careful conversations with tissues on the table and someone neutral in the room. Not for the phone at 8 in the morning when my son finally called and he sounded like himself. 2 months later, I sat at Daniel and Melissa's kitchen table on a Sunday. Melissa had made coffee. I had brought nothing, no casserole, no gifts. I had come with just myself, which felt both insufficient and correct. We talked for 2 hours. It was not comfortable. Melissa told me things that were hard to hear that she had felt, from the beginning of their marriage, that nothing she did was quite as good as the way I would have done it, and she'd never felt she could say so. That the pantry thing had felt like a confirmation of something she'd feared for years. That she loved Daniel, and she loved her daughters, and she was trying to build a life that was hers, and she needed me to let it be hers. I told her that I hadn't meant it that way. I told her that I saw now how it had landed regardless of meaning. I told her about Gerald's chair, and the silence in my house, and the Luna moth, and the apple cake I'd eaten standing up at the counter, both pieces, alone. I didn't tell her any of it as an accusation. I told her because she'd been honest with me, and honesty deserved honesty back. She cried a little. I did too. I won't say we became close after that. That's not how these things work, and I've lived long enough to stop expecting the story to resolve cleanly. But something opened that had been closed, and open is better, even when it's uncomfortable. At the end of the visit, Claire came downstairs in her pajamas even though it was 2 in the afternoon because it was Sunday, and Melissa had apparently decided Sundays were for pajamas as long as you wanted, which was the kind of parenting detail I found genuinely charming, and I told her so. Claire climbed into my lap without asking, the way 5-year-olds do, as if laps are simply public property available to whoever needs them. "Grandma," she said, "I got your letter." About the apple cake. I looked at Melissa over the top of Claire's head. Melissa's expression was complicated, but she didn't look away. "I kept them," Claire said, "in my special box. Sophie has hers too. They had received them, all of them." "Do you still have some?" Claire asked. "Apple cake?" "I can make more," I said. She settled further into my lap, satisfied, already moving on to something else the way children do, absolutely certain the cake would materialize because she'd asked for it, and I was her grandmother, and that's how grandmothers work. She wasn't wrong. I'm not going to tell you the story ends perfectly. There are still Sundays I drive to the house, and then sit in the parking lot of a gas station 2 blocks away for 10 minutes deciding whether to call first, and the answer is always yes, always call first, and sometimes it still costs me something to do it. Melissa and I will probably never be easy with each other the way I was easy with Gerald, the way I am easy with Ruth. That's all right. Easy isn't the only kind of love worth having. What I know is this. Sophie is 9 now. Last month, she called me on the phone by herself, from her room, to tell me that she'd gotten the highest grade in her class on a history project. And she called me before she called anyone else. And she said, "I wanted you to know first, Grandma." I don't know what I did to deserve that. I don't know if I did anything. Maybe she just loves me the way children love people who show up consistently and bring apple cake and write letters about Luna moths and eat 2 pieces standing at the counter in Gerald's kitchen. Maybe that's enough. I think Gerald would say that's more than enough. He'd be right, of course. He usually was. I just never told him so often enough. And that's the other thing age teaches you, that the small and ordinary moments of love are not small at all. They are the whole of it. They are everything. And the only tragedy is not recognizing them until you're sitting alone in someone's chair, eating cake by yourself, finally understanding what you had.